Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
EU leaders meeting in Strasbourg have been giving their first formal reaction to Theresa May's Brexit speech. The Prime Minister of Malta, which holds the EU presidency, said any deal had to be inferior to the relationship Britain enjoys at the moment. With both British and EU politicians trying not to antagonise each other, Boris Johnson has been blamed for doing the opposite. He's been accused of inappropriate language when he appeared to compare France's President Hollande to a World War II guard administering punishment beatings. Our political editor Laura Koonsberg explains.
Watch out, chaps. I'm worried about you falling over.
Watch out, Foreign Secretary, more like. It's his job to win friends and influence around the world. On tour in India today.
Do I come and say hello here? How do you
But
do?
as the delicate process of leaving the EU begins, rather indelicate words about our old friends and foes, the French.
If Monsieur Hollande wants to administer punishment beatings to anybody who chooses to escape, rather in the manner of some sort of World War II movie, then I don't think that is the way forward. And I think actually it's not in the interests of our friends and our partners.
From thousands of miles away, he was slammed as crass. Not exactly what you'd expect from a foreign minister, one diplomat told me. Awkward, when back home the Prime Minister is urging everyone to play nice.
The point he made was a reasonable one, but the language has got to be extremely careful in dealing with colleagues and friends.
What does Boris do? He comes up with these extraordinary phrases of which we should all be ashamed.
Boris Johnson's team says he was just making the point that it makes no sense for the rest of the EU to treat Britain harshly. But only yesterday, Theresa May was publicly reminding ministers here at home of the need for discipline. And with a difficult deal ahead, Britain needs all the friends it has. Language matters, but it's the words and attitudes of European leaders that will prove vital. Yesterday, the Prime Minister appealed to her EU counterparts, urging them to behave as good friends, even as we leave. The arch-European, Jean-Claude Juncker, who leads the Commission which will manage the deal, was suing for peace.
We are not in an hostile mood. We want a fair deal with Britain and a fair deal for Britain, but a fair deal means a fair deal for the European Union.
Yet Europe's leaders are in no mood to let Britain divide and conquer. Their goal right now is sticking together.
Theresa May
We now have a clearer idea of what Britain wants, Angela Merkel said. The most important thing is that Europe is not divided. And in public and in private, here's the reality. Whatever the UK asks for, the rest of the European Union will not do a deal where the terms of trade are as cushy outside as in.
We want a fair deal for the United Kingdom, but that deal necessarily needs to be inferior to membership.
Are you playing hardball, Prime Minister?
She may well smile. Her speech yesterday pleased most of her party. But Theresa May is still under attack for not giving MPs enough of a say.
It's not so much the Iron Lady as the Irony Lady.
I've got a plan. He doesn't have a clue.
Next Tuesday, it's over to the courts, who could force the government to give detail, much more detail, to Parliament before the technical process of extricating ourselves from the EU begins. In these negotiations, it will not always seem that ministers are in charge. Laura Koonsberg, BBC News, Westminster.
Our Europe correspondent Damien Grammaticus is in Strasbourg for us. Damien, I guess EU leaders have had time to digest Mrs May's speech and come up with a more formal reaction today. What did you make of their language?
Well, it's very interesting. I think the comments by Boris Johnson, although some here see them as at best insensitive and at worst quite offensive, really have not made a very big impact, because here the view is that there are very serious issues at stake. And the important thing to be remembered here is that what they're saying is that the UK needs to understand that it is trying to achieve some unprecedented things. Theresa May wants to have a free trade deal and in an unprecedented amount of time, within 2 years. For that, she needs goodwill on behalf of the negotiating partners here. Now, what the Maltese Prime Minister, who will chair the EU countries, said was that Theresa May had made a political decision to prioritise stopping the free movement of people, and the UK leaving the single market would not achieve as good a deal outside. Very, very clear on that. Angela Merkel also very clear today, saying that outside the EU, the UK could not cherry pick because from the EU's perspective, any deal would not offer benefits which would make any other country want also to follow the same path, to be outside the EU. From the EU's point of view, that is what would do the greatest harm to their unity. George.
OK, Damien, thank you very much. Two banks, HSBC and UBS, have confirmed they will transfer jobs from London to Europe after the Prime Minister said Brexit would mean Britain would leave the European single market. Well, our business editor Simon Jack is at the World Economic Forum in Davos. Simon, HSBC have talked about this before, so I guess, they weren't bluffing, were they?
No, it seems they were not, George. They have been saying for months that if we were to leave the single market, then they would move about 1,000 high-paid bankers to Paris. And we also learned today a little bit more about how much business they'll be taking with them. They'll take with them 20% of HSBC's European banking revenue. Now, they wouldn't split that out for me today when I spoke to them, but it's comfortably in the hundreds of millions, potentially billions worth of revenue. Now, that's not the same thing as profit, but still a big chunk. And UBS also confirmed today on plans that they could move up to 1,000 bankers, most likely to Frankfurt. And remember, this will be a hit to the exchequer, of course. There'll be few violins for bankers leaving, but just remember, these are some of the highest paid people in the country, making hundreds of thousands of pounds each. So the exchequer will see a hit. There'll be erosion of London's place in the global marketplace for financial services. So it seems very clear that what were once contingency plans have now, since Theresa May's speech, become a reality.
Simon, thank you.
Theresa May was tonight enveloped in a whole new Brexit storm over a remark by her Foreign Secretary. Yesterday's tricky keynote speech by the PM had been broadly well received, even among top Eurocrats, and Mrs May emerged intact from a combative Commons question time today. But then came Boris Johnson's unscripted intervention, comparing France's President Hollande to a World War II prison guard administering punishment beatings. Abhorrent was just one of the many instant condemnations, as our political correspondent Carl Dinnan reports.
The Prime Minister could have been forgiven for congratulating herself on yesterday's well-received speech on Brexit, although not everyone would choose their words so carefully today. In Europe, heads were turned by Mrs May's speech, although Angela Merkel, hosting the Italian Prime Minister, was characteristically cautious in her remarks. The be-all and end-all is that Europe does not let itself be divided, she said, and we will ensure that with very intensive contacts. In Strasbourg, the European Council President warned against a pick-and-mix Brexit, but was otherwise diplomatic.
I want to underline that we took note of the warm and balanced words of Prime Minister May on European integration, which were much closer to the narrative of Winston Churchill than that of the American President-elect Trump.
But another Churchill fan, the Foreign Secretary, was rather less diplomatic. Responding to comments from a French government source, he compared the French president to a World War II prison guard.
I think that if Monsieur Hollande wants to administer punishment beatings to anybody who chooses to escape, rather in the manner of some sort of World War II movie, then I don't think that is the way forward. And I think actually it's not in the interests of our friends and our partners.
The Swedish Prime Minister told ITV News that Mr Johnson should grow up.
We have said all the time from the Swedish point of view that we need to act, everybody needs to act adult, and we need to act in a pragmatic way. It's a very complicated situation. It's not good for the European Union, so let's not make it worse.
Not what the Prime Minister needed as she fended off Labour criticisms of her Brexit plan.
Can I urge her to stop her threat of a bargain basement Brexit? a low-pay tax haven on the shores of Europe. It won't necessarily damage the EU, but it would certainly damage this country.
What I set out yesterday was a plan for a global Britain, bringing prosperity to this country and jobs to people and spreading economic growth across the country. I've got a plan. He doesn't have a clue.
This evening, Mrs May travelled to the World Economic Forum in Davos, where she hopes to spend time promoting her Brexit strategy rather than defending her Foreign Secretary. But Downing Street were clearly exasperated today to find themselves having to defend Boris Johnson, saying he hadn't called anyone a Nazi. Now, it won't derail anything, but it's clearly very unhelpful at such a sensitive time, and things will only get more difficult. Next Tuesday, the Supreme Court could well order the Prime Minister to hold a vote in Parliament before she even begins the process of leaving the European Union.
Carl, thank you.
Now, Europe's leaders have been telling Theresa May how difficult her plan for Brexit is going to be to negotiate after her speech yesterday and warning to them not to cut up rough. Downing Street, however, had to defend the Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, who was accused of abhorrent, crass and deeply unhelpful language as he compared the French president's approach to Britain to a prison camp guard in a World War II movie issuing punishment beatings to someone trying to escape. Here's our political editor, Gary Gibbon.
Die Briten planen definitiv einen harten Brexit.
In one chorus, Europe judged it hard Brexit.
Theresa May annonce un Brexit total.
Czeka nas twardy Brexit. Theresa May had chosen full separation. She was slamming the door, one paper said. That risked leaving Britain diminished. In Strasbourg, the European Parliament's man attached to the Brexit negotiations taunted British MEPs and the UK's attempts to woo America's president-elect.
Why you are still here? I'm asking myself. Go to the United States. Go to the inauguration of Mr. Trump instead of being here.
The President of the European Council seemed to hint that Theresa May's hopes of getting some of the benefits of the EU's customs union without being a full member might be out of the question.
Yesterday's speech by Prime Minister May proves that the unified position of 27 member states on the indivisibility of the single market was finally understood and accepted by London. It would be good if our partners also understood that there will be no place for pick-and-choose tactics in our future negotiations.
Well, British ministers have been saying negotiating a trade agreement with Europe will be relatively easy because British trade already conforms to EU standards. The tone in Brussels is very different.
It will be a very, very, very difficult negotiation because Britain has to be considered as a third country, which I'm not used to express myself in these terms. I'm unhappy about this.
The Foreign Secretary visiting India waded in, accusing France's president of wanting to punish Britain for leaving the EU, comparing him to a German Second World War prison guard.
I think that if Monsieur Hollande wants to administer punishment beatings to anybody who chooses to escape, rather in the manner of some sort of World War II movie, then I don't think that that is the way forward. And I think actually it's not in the interests of our friends and our partners.
Number 10 hid any irritation, but worked hard on the tone of yesterday's speech, and Second World War film references were most certainly not part of Theresa May's script yesterday or today when she responded to attacks from Jeremy Corbyn.
Can I urge her to stop her threat of a bargain basement Brexit? A low-pay tax haven on the shores of Europe. It won't necessarily damage the EU, but it would certainly damage this country.
I've got a plan. He doesn't have a clue.
The Supreme Court has announced that on Tuesday it'll rule whether Parliament should debate a bill ahead of Brexit negotiations. Whips have advised the government they can deliver victory in both houses of Parliament in time for the Prime Minister to notify the EU in March that Britain is leaving.
Well, while Boris Johnson says he can sketch out post-Brexit trade deals on the back of an envelope, one of the world's most powerful trading nations, China, has just opened a new route into Britain. The first direct freight train from China pulled into Barking in East London today after an 18-day journey across continents. Our business correspondent, Helia Ebrahimi, was there to meet us.
rolling gently into a siding in East London. Is this the sound for the future of British trade? With a toot and a couple of party poppers, the first overground train all the way from China ended its 12,000-kilometre journey, more a symbol of global impact than a freight train full of goods.
Well, this is a key time, perhaps the most important time for UK trade relations with China, because now is the time that the UK has the goods and services that China needs as it moves into its new phase of new normal.
Increasing trade with the East has been a British preoccupation for centuries. Kings, companies have got rich off the rewards. And today, for the government, this train and its route represents a glimmer of hope. But the promise of Eastern expansion is going to have to deliver a lot more track to make up for the uncertainties of Brexit.
Anyone, I mean, I've worked with India and China for the last 10 years, and anyone who has done work with those governments knows that they're not going to do a deal on trade unless there's a deal on immigration too. And so that's why I think the government is just being a bit optimistic if it thinks it's going to get away with a trade bargain that has, low barriers to trade and high barriers to people. That's just not going to wash with governments like India and China.
Not the message today from the Foreign Secretary, who was talking of countries queuing up to sign deals, painting a picture of a Britain invigorated by global growth.
We may be leaving the EU, we may be taking back control of our borders, but my Indian friends, I say to you, that does not mean we want to haul up the drawbridge.
But there's a long way to go when you examine the latest figures. At the moment, 60% of our trade in goods is with Europe. If you add imports and exports, our number one partner is Germany, with more than £92 billion worth of trade, while the US is the second single destination. China is third with almost half that amount, and India lags at 17th with just £10 billion. And experienced business heads are sceptical that worldwide arrangements can bridge the European gap so quick.
What the Prime Minister announced yesterday was that immigration, controlling immigration, was more important than jobs and prosperity, than trade, that access to the single market. And by leaving the single market, we're erecting trade barriers. What, of course, she then goes on to say is, but there are these wonderful other trading opportunities. But the idea that we're going to get them in 2 years is pure fantasy. And the idea that they're going to make up for the trade we lose with the European Union, I think it's a big stretch.
Are we in a weaker position with the rest of the world now?
Yes, undoubtedly.
The question remains whether the divorce with Europe will make us more vulnerable to the sharp end of global negotiations, or, as the government believes, set us free to deliver better trade deals with new partners down the track.
And just one other bit of Brexit news. In the last few minutes, the German newspaper Handelsblatt has reported that Goldman Sachs is considering moving up to 1,000 staff from London to Frankfurt because of concerns about leaving the European Union. Earlier today, two other banks, UBS and HSBC, said they were considering moving hundreds of staff out of London too.